Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, why are so many leaders of organizations obsessed with being efficient? And why is this obsession often bad for organizations and the people who work in them? What could leaders do differently to make their organizations more productive and more humane at the same time? This and many other big questions have been the focus of our extremely engaging guest, Martijn Sjoorda. Martijn works exclusively at senior leader level, which has often been described as a place not for the faint of heart. He's head of practice development of System 2, and he's also one of the co-founders of the Fearless organization, together with Professor Amy Edmondson. Martin works with organizations on the intersection of strategy and psychology to deliver high performance. And his specialities include strategy, learning, dialogue, structural dynamics, large system change. He's got significant design and program management experience at the most senior levels in multinational corporations. And Martin also has an interesting story of being qualified as a psychotherapist and has been editor of the Dutch edition of Presence by the very legendary Peter Senge. He's also author of the Crack the Code, Core Technologies to Exceed and Excel in Business. This gives him a brilliant commercial insight to complement his practitioner experience. And Martin is best described as a citizen of the world with a wealth of intercultural experiences across 4 continents. In fact, he actually speaks 6 languages in Dutch, English, German, and French. Danny and I, we've opted to do today's interview in English with him. but really welcome, Martin. It's great to have you join us.
Welcome. It's fantastic to have you with us. So we're just going to kick off. Could you just tell us a bit more about the work that you do and what your role involves?
I've been interested in how beasts called organizations work for a very, very long time. I'm a self-described geek. I started reading business books when I was 14. It's always been clear that I was going to make what I did about working in organizations. So after my first sort of stints in the global supply chain industry, with great many thanks to my uncle who let me tinker on his company, and where I basically learned the basics. I landed in the IT industry, and then at the tender age of 27, I was heading up a business unit in that stock market listed company. But I also had a great mentor who was the chief operating officer, and he let me tinker on the company as well. And that's in essence how, at a certain point, about 25 years ago, I transitioned and became a consultant. So I've been an independent in various connections and affiliations for the past 25 years or so. And I think the mainstay is always, for me, although I didn't coin that immediately, is how can you change the context in such a way that change becomes easy? And so what I do now with clients, quite often with executive committees or top management or whatever you want to call them, is to have the conversation on the one hand about what's really bugging them, what's keeping them up at night, and then where would they like to go, and then we have in essence a space where we can do something. And then rather than doing classical leadership development, we work on a business problem, and in the wake of working on that business problem, it becomes very clear where there is friction between people, and then we deal with that friction by handing them some simple tools. I like to call them Lego bricks of human process technology that they can then take into their daily practice in working together as leaders and managers to do interaction better. And that's the main thing of my work. And as a couple of examples, for the last couple of years, I've been working for a really large pharmaceutical company in the immunology space, but I'm also working for a very small immunology startup. I'm probably likely to start doing some work around team effectiveness for one of the leading tech companies in the world. So it's very, very varied, but it's actually always, I think, about improving the quality of the interaction, because if you improve the quality of the interaction, you're likely improve your outcomes exponentially.
And you work with senior teams, so why that focus, and what drew you to that kind of lens?
So when I was going through my therapy training, one of the mainstays in the latter part was working with the masks as defined by Reich, and one of the masks is the masochist mark, and I guess I must be a masochist. Because working for very senior teams is not, as you said in the introduction, Gary, not always for the faint of heart. But the reason why I like doing that is because you can make so much impact if you are actually able to get people engaged from the top. And then it's not to say that you need to then do stuff top down, but it's really helpful if it's not about they down there need to do the change. It's about we're actually, as an executive team, driving the change. So that's the why behind it. And also organizations, often not out of bad intent, tend to be quite terrible places to be in. So the quickest way to make them better places to be in is to start with the people who have the biggest levers for influencing and changing that.
Do you think the senior leaders often underestimate the influence and impact they have on the rest of the organization?
That's a really, really good question, because I think they both underestimate and overestimate it. And where they underestimate it is where in what Art Kleiner has defined in Core Group Who Really Matters as the amplification phenomenon, which is that people think that they say something with the dial on 1, but because they have a certain position, it lands at 11 and therefore is taken very seriously, and all sorts of things are put in motion. And it was actually not necessarily the intent of that senior executive to do that. That's a space, but it also works the other way around, in the sense that what comes up through the layers in the organization, and which should sort of land at 11, tends to be dialed back to 1, so they can brush things aside. So that's the underestimate bit. The overestimate bit is that they think they are running, often think, because they've been trained to do that in business school, that they think they run a machine. And as a result, they can design things to make the machine work differently, and then push that into the machine, and then it will happen. And I think that's where they overestimate their influence, and that's why I'm always working with the notion of trying to find people who are willing to do change and to engage those people in co-creating the change, rather than driving it in a mechanistic way from the top down.
It's a really interesting thing, isn't it? How the power of how you conceptualize the organization can have a huge impact in terms of how you lead it as well. Why do so many leaders have the definition or metaphor of an organization in the minds of it being a machine? Because often practitioners will often describe it as anything but.
You've read my article, but the listeners haven't. But the article I completed towards the end of last year was called The Efficiency Fallacy. And in it, one of the things I call out is how Frederick Taylor is actually a fraud, but there is a vested interest in the whole industry around consulting, around leadership development, around business schools, around the big 4 consulting firms, to perpetuate the myth that you can do scientific management as per Taylor, because it pays the bills for an inordinate amount of people. But the metaphor and the ensuing methodology are for driving efficiencies from the notion that if you drive for efficiencies, things will get better. But as dear old Peter Drucker has rightfully posited, one, there is no reason why organizations couldn't be made to be more productive and more humane at the same time. And secondly, you need to understand what is effective before you can be efficient. And I once famously said to the CFO of a large airliner, when he was just explaining that he was going to do a transformation, which in essence was just a mega cost-cutting operation, I said, so Frank, what you're telling me is you're going to shrink your way to growth. Can you please tell me how that's supposed to work? So I often say good intentions, bad outcomes, because it's not that these people have an ill intent. It's just that they've been taught to frame things and look at things in a particular and specific way that is actually usually not helpful to achieving the goals they state they want to achieve. So that's quite often a hard but a very worthwhile conversation to have with people.
Yeah, it's a really interesting paper. We'll put the link to it in the show notes if you're happy with us to do that. There was a couple of things that stood out for me, because you do talk about the fact that organizations often sort of create really difficult conditions. So you talk like innovation versus efficiency as an issue, like we're trying to achieve both things at the same time. But there was one particular thing that stood out that you mentioned, which is you talked about how you often challenge leaders in the moment about how you actually work with them. You said something along the lines of, asking leaders, do you like being told what to do? Could you just pick up that thread for us? I just thought it was such a, actually laughed out loud when I read that.
What I say in the article is what I actually often do. I once famously had a conversation. It's another example with a business group president. And I said, do you think change starts here in your office, or do you think they need to do it outside? And then he said, well, I think it's mainly for them to do it. Well, and then I stood up and I said, well, then I'm going to have to shake your hand, because then I'm not the right person to work with you. Because if you don't participate and start this, the likelihood that they are going to do it is not very big. So that's an example. But another example is, and that's in the article, is I often also literally ask people in the C-suite, do you like being told what to do? And they go, no. Okay. Did you get to where you are today by doing what you were told? No. Okay, can you explain me why then most of your models for doing things with people in your organization space is based on telling them what to do? And then I shut up.
And then just wait for the wheels to turn.
And then quite often people go, yeah, that is rather remarkable.
Yeah, because I guess it's surfacing the implicit rules that govern how people work, isn't it? And that's quite an important way of challenging people. And I guess that's the really healthy role of a great facilitator and a great coach, isn't it? The ability to ask questions that maybe others and their peers don't ask them.
Yeah, and because as part and parcel of that amplification thing that we talked about earlier, there's also the space where most of the time the more senior people get, the less feedback / pushback they get. So hopefully they pay people like us to be behind closed doors and to do admit that it's perhaps good to take in a different angle.
One of the things Gary mentioned in your kind of introduction was the Fearless organisation that you co-founded, one of the co-founders with Professor Amy Edmondson, a name that a lot of people will have heard of and will associate with the whole kind of psychological safety. How did that come about?
How that came about was in just before I quit my last real job. There was somebody who said, Martijn, you should do something with dialogue. So an ex-KPMG consultant we were working with at the time on doing OD in the firm where I was employed. And I said, okay, that's interesting. But then I talked to somebody who'd done a program. So I got sent to what was then still the Center for Organizational Learning at MIT. So I had some training from Peter Sanger. I became involved in the Society for Organizational Learning, but I also did this program with Peter Garrett and Bill Isaacs around dialogue. And that's where I also met David Cantor. And David Cantor was originally a psychologist who did a PhD. And he did some fundamental research into sort of personality profiles. And he did a really cool one because he got a grant from the National Institute for Mental Health in the mid-70s of the then astronomical amount of $250,000, with which he then went on to install tape recorders in the houses of 21 ordinary American families and recorded every single interaction for 6 weeks, and then took all of that material with a team of PhDs and started codifying 4 layers of people's personality. So David's work funnily found its way into organizations because a couple of children's shoes, the team at the MIT Center for Organizational Learning wasn't functioning optimally, so they were looking for a coach, and that was David, and that's how this whole language around what probably most OD practitioners will know, the 4-player model, move, follow, oppose, bystand, will probably know, found its way into organizations. So I've been working with David until he died, and I'm one of the people who safeguarded that his legacy landed with the Dutch firm I was affiliated with, so that you can still get those boundary profiles, and that Amy and her colleague Joe in the executive MBA were using David's instrument and that work to help people understand how boardroom dynamics work. And then Amy published her book, The Fearless Organization, and I read it, and I had been in contact with her, and I found a really scrappy Qualtrics survey somewhere hidden in a 2008 HBR article, and I said to her, but Amy, this is way too important to live in a book and a scrappy quality service. So I helped found and built the Fearless organization at its inception, and that's probably been an important part in really putting psychological safety and measuring it on the agenda. So basically just staying in touch and then iterating on relationships.
And how important is psychological safety when it comes to teams, and particularly at that senior level?
Incredibly important, but it's been scientifically proven through Project Aristotle at Google with 180 teams across 5 years with 12,000 data points, that there are 5 factors that influence the effectiveness and the well-being of a team. But the absolute bedrock and foundation, because it also weighs for 39% over the other 4 factors, is psychological safety. Because if you don't have psychological safety, you cannot have sustained high performance, period. And as I like to frame it for senior executives, when I do keynotes about it, fear makes you dumb. So it's an incredibly dumb management strategy. Because what happens is literally your executive functions shut down, you end up in your reptile brain, and unhelpfully that starts pumping unhelpful hormones down your spine with a 3-second head start over your executive function. So screaming at people, putting the fear of God in them, not very useful management strategy.
And how, just a question I know is going to come up, how do people get out of that situation? So they've created a culture of fear. They have teams that are terrified of them. Where do they start unpacking that and kind of making it better?
Yeah. Also, because just a build on that as well, because sometimes leaders can find it quite surprising that they create fear, don't they? Because they can almost be 95% nice and 5% aggressive, and that can leave a shadow as well. It's quite complicated, isn't it?
It's very complicated, also because I think once you get into the C-suite, you can just, calling a spade, you can afford to be nice, because there are other people right below you or in your staff that are willing to do the unpleasant bidding, and you can just be nice and gregarious from there on up, assuming that you are not a psychopath. So that was one aspect, but another aspect to your original question, starting by looking at what's going on in their own team, which often isn't a team but more a group that follows a ritualized agenda, and to have the conversation about how that plays out, and then hopefully having the skill as a consultant/facilitator to really gently sort of highlight what's going on in the room. And the most famous one was one of the first ones I did for a financial institution, where the head of trading said, wait, what? We have low psychological safety? I thought it looked really great. And I went, well, Joe, you can look at the data, and we've just explained you the benchmark, and you can look around the room what the impact was of what you just did, because you could see people's body language shift quite significantly. Fair point.
But this is often why working with senior leaders is not for the faint of heart, because there's always these sort of minor risks or major risks that you're taking constantly, trying to sort of couch that feedback and get them. Obviously not that you hold the feedback, it's obviously that you're collating feedback, but it's still that's the vessel that passes it on. There's always that danger, isn't there?
Yeah, but I think that's the important part, and that's one of the terms I came up with. I think if you have a good process or a good instrument and a good process, what it affords you to do is to put the thing that we're supposed to talk about in the middle. So in dialogic terms, rather than being in the lower quadrant, which is breakdown, you want to end up in inquiry, which is the top right quadrant in the model. And the way to do that is to have people realize that they don't have to be their point of view, but they can have a point of view. And you do that by skillfully putting what you're looking at in the middle and saying it's not about a blame game, or saying that, I don't know, you're too too directive or you are not forthcoming enough. It's about putting it in the middle and then figuring out, and that's hard, a new way to talk about that.
Brilliant. And you've got such an interesting background, that fundamental kind of, at a very young age, sort of leading, in really highly responsible positions. And then you became a psychotherapist. And what was your journey into where you are now? What drove that?
Well, frankly, I was, and I still am failing in many domains of life, because I'm human. so around 2010 or so, I thought, yeah, I can go into therapy again, or I can actually just do full-on therapy training, because I keep bumping into dysfunctional dynamics in myself, but there's dysfunctional dynamics in groups, in people I coach individually, so I might as well go the whole 9 yards and complete proper training for it. Also because I just find it endlessly fascinating, and you probably saw the things. One of the things I like to say in groups is, well, your parents tend to have more influence over your business results than you do. So it's useful to understand, because in David Cantor's terms, when we're clashing in a team, what's clashing is not two adult people, but it's two childhood stories, and the stories we've subsequently start telling ourselves about who we are or how we think we should show up.
And how do you kind of introduce? Do you go as far as introducing that in the work, that's what's happening here, or is it just through questioning? I guess I'm intrigued by that kind of those kind of really deep questions need consent, don't they?
Well, there are two ways in which I do it. One is quite often a workshop with me, with any team, will involve something that I learned somewhere along the way, which is called the musical dinner. And what we do is we ask people to pick a piece of music, and the instruction is quite specific, because it is pick a piece of music and be willing to share the story about why that piece of music is important to you or why it moved you, and be prepared to go a little further than you would normally go in the work setting whilst guarding your personal boundaries. And that is those are magical evenings, because then, without slapping a whole body of theory onto people, they're in effect sharing a part or a large part of their childhood story and how they came to be where they are today. And then quite often there are tears, and there's hearty laughter, and there's also the, crikey, if I'd known that about you, I would have treated you so radically differently. Which goes to show that once you have shared your stories with each other, you can't hate each other anymore. And then the other bit is just really pragmatically taking at least the 4-player model, slapping 4 placards on the ground, explaining in a team session what those 4 positions are, and that you can do all 4 of them. And then just getting people to saying to people, well, so if you can't stop yourself from what you do normally, where would you go stand? So now just go stand there, and that gives you an immediate light-hearted snapshot of what people think the dynamics in their team are, and the dialogue ensues, and then they typically take that on board and start inviting those 4 behaviors as and where appropriate and useful.
Danny, do you want to? This is some really good stuff here. Danny, do you want to go on the leadership development question?
Yeah, so I spotted a post that you, I think Steve Hearson had highlighted one of your old posts about why I hate leadership development. Yeah. So I just wanted to
wonderfully provocative title.
I just wanted to unpack that a bit and just see what do you think we're getting wrong about traditional leadership development, and what alternatives should we be looking at?
So I've formulated it rather crassly, but that's entertaining. And it's also for the purpose of entertaining and provoking people into thought. It's a good thing. But in essence, if you look at classical leadership development programs, and I've run them, so I'm guilty as charged. I did them as well. The feedback is overridingly somewhere between 4 out of 5 and 5 out of 5, and it's all good and fine. And then if you look at the qualitative feedback, it's always something like, it was so good to finally connect/reconnect with my international peers, and it was marvelous. And at a certain point I thought, well, if that is really the overriding sense, why don't we just, book a bunch of EasyJet tickets, drop 25 grand on a nice venue and a DJ, and have a great party, and all get smashed, and then we have the same outcome likely. And also quite often, and they still happen like that. I mentioned Helmut in the article, who's likely going to be your manager somewhere in the next 3 years, and he's going to be in the same room with you. And then quite often still there are these two nice ladies from global corporate HR who are observing. So the chances that is a context where you're going to go full out and work on your demons is not very big. So what I'm arguing for in the article is that there are two ways in which you could do leadership development. The first one is it's the program where you get sent to where you're likely not with your peers, and where you actually get to work on whatever it is that is standing in the way of you being a fully functioning, happy and mentally healthy professional. And you just do group work, and the boss pays for it, or you pay for it yourself, but nobody gets insight into what actually happened there. And that's one way of doing it. And the other one is, and I think I referred to it earlier, is rather than spending money on doing horizontal rungs of leadership development as people progress through the matrix, invest that money, and less actually, invest that money in a team and get people internally trained up, but also use people like us to work with your team on an actual business challenge, and then infuse that program, which can be a 90-day program with a couple of waypoints in it, where you also measure where you're getting at with your outcomes, and infuse that with some building blocks like the dialogue model, and practicing with that, like practicing with, hey, what's going on in the room, and how can you be more effective at having balancing advocacy and inquiry in your conversation, and so on, but in a really light-hearted way. And then you tend to get much better outcomes, but you also make direct business impact.
Yeah, because I think you talked about like the 3 R's of rhythm, rigor, and reflection being a core component of that. Can you just open that up a little bit?
So one of the things that I did with a management team in the pharmaceutical industry in the last 2 years is we created a specific rhythm. So I think agile is a church, but so going full on agile and not contextualizing and just taking the good bits, I'm not in favor. But the notion of building a rhythm that's in agile, but in other methodologies as well, is a really good one, because I think what we tend to do is we have these standing meetings that are part of the tradition and the rituals of a company, and just because we never look at them, and we have, as humans, we have addition bias, so we'd rather slap something on and rather take something away. We don't examine the meeting rhythm, but I think you should regularly look at your meeting rhythm, because I think that's also a way for organizing the future of work and not getting bogged down in it's either in the office or it's fully remote. No, it's not. It's creating a rhythm that works for a specific context. And there is probably status, which is short and sweet. Then there is just your regular meeting, but with a backlog, and the discipline to not do 17 things in an hour, but to do 1 or 2 or 3, and to then actually have an outcome at the end of the meeting, because then it's useful to have the meeting. And then the last bit is you have to figure out a way to, certainly the more senior you get, you have to have reflective space and collective reflective space. So one of my proudest achievements is that this specific executive committee has chosen to spend 4 hours a month without an agenda together. And they've now upped their game, because they're going to be in their headquarters for 2 weeks, 3 times a year. So they have time to bump into each other and actually do business with each other. So that's about building the rhythm. Then the rigor bit it's a very specific definition, but it boils down to that we have a habit of being so chronically busy that we don't do the thorough deep dive on things. And I think we could be much more effective if we looked at, hey, what's really going on? So what's actually going on below the waterline? And let's not choose the first order solution, but let's see what the second order solution would be. So that rigor in that sense, and then rigor also in terms of carrying it through. And then the last bit is reflection. So if you're a team, I think you should have a reflective practice, because otherwise you can never be a good team.
This has hurt my neck because I'm nodding so much. This is brilliant. It's so true, isn't it? I guess I'm really curious what you're saying there. Like, so you said, like, so the senior team comes together for 4 hours without any agenda.
Yeah, and they can choose to hang out. They can choose to take one big chunk that they want to look at, or they can conclude sometimes that they don't need the 4 hours and address one smaller thing. But it's just that if you because a global corporate agenda is such occasions, if you don't put it on the calendar, it'll be driven out.
There's probably a lot of people listening into this going, that sounds brilliant. But how on earth would I convince my senior team to have 4 hours together with no agenda? Because we, like you said, we live in such an action bias world. How do you sort of get people to understand the value of that and what can emerge in that time? Because it's critical space, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the thing is that we're all, until it gets knocked out of us in primary and secondary school, we're all by nature systems thinkers, because that's how we learn to walk and do all the things that little humans need to learn to do. And that gets driven out of us. But inherently, we still have that capability to look at things from a whole systems perspective. So quite often, when I start working with a team, we run an exercise that was once conceived by Peter Singer, and I've amended a little. But it's, in essence, it's an exercise called What's the Real Problem? And it takes about an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. And what you do is you go through a series of questions, and the end point is always, for that specific context, we have seen the enemy and he is us. And you do it by looking at what's working well, what's not working so well, and then you focus on what's not working so well. So that's a relatively safe space, if well facilitated, to put all the elephants in the room on the whiteboard. And then you start unpacking that, not by saying, okay, what are we going to do to solve this? But you say, in a couple of rounds, the first one being, what is it in our behavior that rewards us to keep these problems alive? And then the second round is, there are implicit and explicit rules and structures in this company. So what is it in our implicit and explicit rules and structures that rewards us to keep these problems alive? And then typically we have values, and we have espoused values, and we have values in use. So what between values in use and espoused values is it that rewards us to keep these problems alive? That's slowing down, but it's slowing down to go faster, because it yields two things in terms of output. One is, over the course of, let's say, a 2 or 3 day workshop, that's in essence the gold dust that you take into, okay, these are the problems below the waterline that we're going to solve for with each other, and we're going to come up with 2 or 3 simple initiatives that we're going to work on from there on up. And then the other one is, okay, we really need more time with each other to prevent us from coming to this point where we are actually basically stumbling and we're not hitting our corporate strategy goals or whatever it is you're trying to do.
Genius.
So powerful.
Too much honor, but it's really about facilitating a context where people can go, yeah, we need to do these things differently.
What do you enjoy most about the role that you do and the work that you do?
I always say in one sentence, I love solving wicked problems with cool people. and that's what I get to do for a living. So that's what I enjoy most about it, is that wildly disparate challenges. I've been lucky to work for, when my life was a little bit unstable between 2017 and 2019, I worked as a principal for Capgemini for 2 years, and I encountered what's called the accelerated solutions environment, which is based on the the design shop model work of M&G Taylor and Rob Evans. And as an example, on lots of things, there's a little barcode, and there's an institute called GS1 that brought that about and organizes that around the world. And then stuff has progressed, and one of the coolest things that I did was we got to work with organization to conceive a global data model, because that would be the next step. Because if you want to move stuff seamlessly through a supply chain, then it's really useful to have a global standard. So we did the inception workshop with people from competitors in the industry, working together to standardize and come up with the basic taxonomy for a global data model. And that's outlandish, but it's really cool to work with people at a very senior level from across industries, and then to find a way forward, and now seeing some 4 or 5 years down the road that is actually being standardized, and it's starting to find its footing. And there's lots of things like that. And of course, obviously, always doing a new strategy for an organization, but with the organizational health side very much embedded in that is fantastic to do.
It's the power of collective IQ, isn't it? When you're actually able to leverage all of that together to focus on one thing, incredible things can happen, can't they?
Yeah, I think one of the nicest compliments someone, and it sounds really simple, but that makes it incredibly difficult at the same time. One of the things somebody said, and I took that as probably one of the nicest compliments I got, was, I see what you do. You create circumstances where things can happen.
You work internationally, so how different is it working in different international contexts? You see the senior teams vary wildly across international boundaries, or are there some commonalities?
But it's probably because I'm Dutch, and we have such a long history of being the tradesmen who just go around the world. I mean, if the French and the English were fighting, we sold muskets to both sides. And the advantage is nobody speaks Dutch, bar for a few people in Belgium and some of the countries we colonized. So you have to immerse yourself in a different culture, because otherwise people just simply don't get you. So, and I'm interested, and you mentioned that I have quite a good facility with foreign languages. That's helpful. And having said all that, you know, some of the stereotypes about culture and the context you walk into in countries are true, but in the end it's about, we make a human connection, and if we take the space to make a real human connection, I've not seen culture as in national or regional culture, even if such a thing is, but at least national culture, I've never seen that sort of get in the way of people finding a way to connect. That said, there are persistent patterns that have cultural origins in companies that are not always useful for being effective. That's totally true.
So if you look back at your career so far, what would you say some of the biggest lessons that you've learned are that you'd share with others?
Get good at doing two adjacent things well, because if you do that, then you can be pretty unbeatable. So it's not always easy for me to sell myself, but once people see what the benefit of somebody who brings a strategy and a psychology angle to a process or a team, it is really, really useful for them, and they love it. So get good at get good at being an independent thinker, and learn to think for yourself, and find tools and methodologies that help you do that. That's one thing. And the other one is my first mentor was David Ogilvy, the founder of Ogilvy, because I wrote him a letter after I read his book when I was 14, and he wrote me back, and we became friends. And one of the things he said in a note that he wrote to me is, you have insatiable curiosity. And I thought I was the original Nosy Parker, but I'm handing the title over to you. And I think being empathetic on the one side and being incisive on the other side is really important, because if you do that in our business, in OD, then if you know what you're talking about, you learn how to ask the right questions, but you do it from a standpoint of empathy and respect, you can almost not fail as an interventionist. And also senior people will take stuff from you, so to say.
How do you invest in your own learning and development?
I'm very fortunate that I have built a group of people, not all of which are on the website. So we, in essence, the Friday here is always a to and fro of lots of people, both clients and colleagues, just coming to the office, and we hang out, we have lunch, and we talk about anything, everything. But part of it is a structured process about talking about what's going on in your life and where do you think you need help. So that's that's a rhythm. We're drinking our own champagne, as the French would say. And the other is I regularly try to do, from a standpoint of curiosity, some form of training or a course that just keeps me. And I'm a voracious reader, so I love reading. And increasingly, because I'm going to be 55 in September, increasingly my way to actually capture my own learning is also just simply by writing. So I can hopefully pass a couple of things on, but while I'm writing, I'm also doing research and then incorporating that in it. And I think that's a good one too. Is
there a particular book or a podcast or a resource that you'd like to recommend and encourage other people to look up and read?
I'm going to say an outlier because it's just so delightfully weird. There's a guy called Rick Rubin, who's one of the most famous record producers in the world, but he's just he's just written a book about creativity, but he has a podcast, and the podcast is called Tetragrammaton, but they're long form interviews with weird people from all walks of life. So there's a 3-hour conversation with Rory Sutherland, a friend of mine, the vice chairman of Ogilvy, about behavioral science, which is brilliant. There's a 2.5-hour interview with Edward Norton, the actor, who is a brilliant human. There's an interview with Tom Hanks, who's just so thoughtful about so many things. So that's like, if you want to get new synapses from it, it's Tetragrammaton, and it's available on Spotify, for example, and it's a delight.
And we always ask this question at the end of every session because we really want to inspire the next generation of OD practitioners or change agents or facilitators to top teams. What advice would you give someone just starting out in their career now, either considering it or they're just taking their first steps?
Pick a leader you like and make sure you get to work for her for a couple of years. I'll share that. I'll give an example. I did that at some point in my career, and that got me to be the head of a business unit and then secretary of the board with a remit for organizational development somewhere in my career. But there's one of my juniors, as they're called in the internal vernacular at Capgemini. It's a really brilliant guy, studied organizational science and change, got a master's degree in it. A really sharp guy, was always picking my brain, still calls me, but took that advice and is now in a really, really senior OD/transformation role globally, because he, obviously on his own merit, but he followed that path.
Well, Martijn, I want to say a huge thank you for today. It's been great. It's been wonderfully practical. You're intensely well read, so we've got some brilliant references to take away from this as well. There's a real sort of honesty to it as well, which has been brilliant. And you are master of the soundbite. I think we've got like 20 really good quotes to take away from today. Which is part of my takeaways today. So I guess one of the takeaways I've got 3, Danny, but I could have about 5. I've got I love the phrase "fear makes you dumb." It's so true, isn't it? But it's so lost easily. That sense that so many senior leaders have the metaphor or the mental model of a machine and what that does, and the importance of challenging that as well. And then also looking at how you sort of challenge organizations and making sure that there's real clarity, particularly in teams around rhythm, rigor, and reflection, and those being the core ingredients. Danny, what are you taking away from today?
I think so much of some of what you've said already, but I think the amplification point that you mentioned at the early stages of that, about how leaders kind of underestimate the amplification, but also in reverse, dial down what they hear, what's coming bottom up. I love the point you made about having a point of view and not being that point of view. I think, if we can encourage more people to take that stance, that would encourage the quality of dialogue. And then the point you made about the space for human connection, how that's so important and overrides everything, or kind of it's the foundation for so much of the work we want to do.
I think we should start a campaign. All organisations should have senior teams that have 4 hours of unagendered time together. The world would be a much more different place, wouldn't it?
There's a great story back in the days when Unilever was doing, in the early noughties, when Unilever was doing a lot of standalone, very beautiful, wonderful leadership development work. And then there was Kiki Dowsett, who grown up through the ranks, I think through Hindustan Lever, who was also on the board. And then he went, well, you see, I think at the beginning of your career, the idea is that you drive around in your Ford Focus with the Lipton brand on it, and you just compete with whoever we're competing at for the shelf space. And if you want to take out 2.5 hours on a Friday afternoon, think about how you can do that better and how you can progress your career, good on you. Much more than that, probably not so useful at that stage in your career. However, at the stage of my career where I am at, I probably should be spending 3 days a week staring out of the window, talking to other people about what the course of the company should be. And so it's a balance, and it'll grow and shrink over time through your career. But just take some time to think, people. It'll do you a world of good.
And if people want to reach out to you, obviously we're going to share the paper that you shared with us today. But if you want to follow your work or connect with you, what's the best way to do it?
I'm very open to connecting on LinkedIn. And if you have a direct question for me, then it's Martijn, which is, we had a whole little skit about it. my name, my first and my last name, which is very complicated for non-Dutch people. I apologize for it. But my email is martijn @system2, and then the number 2.nl, and send me an email or find me, because the benefit of my first and last name is that I'm actually the only Martijn Sjoorda in the world. So you can not find me on LinkedIn or contact the wrong person.
Brilliant. We'll make sure your details are in the show notes as well. And I think that's a very fitting, and I think you are the only one. It's such a brilliant connection of all these different insights and experiences coming together. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. It's been a really engaging conversation. And we love all the tools that you share. It's been really, really practical as well. Martijn's interview now goes into the collection of brilliant guests that we've also got. I think, Danny, we're up to episode at the moment 33, is that right?
I think that's correct, yes.
And we've got a whole range of other guests booked in, and it's just brilliant that people like Martijn are just so generous and sort of sharing their insights. So we hope you really enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel, and if we've earned your like, then please hit the like button, whether you're listening to this on YouTube or on Buzzsprout as well. Thanks very much.